Imagine designing a building that could survive bombs, typhoons, and jungle heat, and be built in a single day. Picture yourself in 1942, standing on a rain-soaked runway at a U.S. naval base in Rhode Island, where engineers are racing against time and terror. The Pacific War is raging. The Japanese are pushing across island chains, and America's young military engineers are being asked to perform miracles. The Navy needed something new, something no one had ever built before. A shelter light enough to ship halfway across the world, strong enough to survive Pacific typhoons, and simple enough that untrained soldiers could erect it in a matter of hours. The result would become one of the most iconic and unsung engineering marvels of the 20th century, the Quonset hut. At Quonset Point Naval Air Station, in the chill of a New England winter, a small team of engineers and draftsmen gathered in a makeshift design office. Their mission had come down from the Navy Bureau of Yards and Docks with near-impossible instructions: develop a structure that could be mass-produced, shipped flat, and assembled by anyone, anywhere. It had to resist wind, water, and even bombs. And the deadline? Just 60 days. No committees, no second chances, no luxury of time. America's war machine was accelerating at a breathtaking pace, and soldiers needed shelter that could follow them from island to island, from the deserts of North Africa to the jungles of the South Pacific. Every part of this story is about problem-solving under pressure. The engineers faced constraints from every angle: limited materials due to wartime rationing, unpredictable climates across the Pacific, and the practical needs of troops who would sleep, eat, plan, and even operate medical units inside these shelters. The Navy wasn't asking for comfort, it was asking for survival. And at the center of that challenge stood a question that blended architecture, physics, and logistics. How do you build something that can stand up to war itself? They began by studying precedents. The British Army had developed something similar during World War I, known as the Nissen hut, a half-cylinder of corrugated iron with wooden ends. It was sturdy, cheap, and easy to produce, but not perfect. It wasn't optimized for tropical climates, and it lacked the modular efficiency that the Americans needed. The U.S. engineers saw potential, but also room for radical improvement. They wanted something lighter, more aerodynamic, and more adaptable, a true evolution of the Nissen idea. The result would not just be a copy, it would be a reinvention. The team at Quonset Point quickly settled on the curved arch shape. The arch wasn't just aesthetically unique, it was structurally genius. A curve distributes stress evenly across its surface, meaning no single part bears the brunt of the force. That allowed the hut to withstand both heavy winds and the concussive shock of nearby explosions. The engineers knew that a flat roof would catch the wind like a sail, but a curved one would deflect it, allowing the Pacific's typhoon winds to slip right over the surface. It was aerodynamic architecture before the term even existed. Next came the question of materials. Steel was strong but heavy, wood was light but prone to rot and warping in humid climates. Their solution was a hybrid, the body made of corrugated galvanized steel, giving strength and rigidity, and the ends made from plywood, which could be cut to fit doorways, windows, and vents. Corrugation was the key innovation. It made the thin sheets of steel act like springs, absorbing impact while keeping the structure light. The galvanization process coated each panel with zinc, protecting it from the salt air and moisture that corroded so many other military structures in the Pacific. Every detail, every bolt was chosen with one thing in mind: durability under fire and nature. Then came the magic of modularity. The hut was divided into sections small enough to fit into the cargo bays of transport ships. Once unloaded, the parts could be assembled like a life-sized kit. You didn't need an engineering degree to build one, just a wrench, a hammer, and a few hours of daylight. 6 to 8 men could assemble a complete Quonset hut in less than 24 hours, even under combat conditions. There were no interior support beams to worry about. The arch itself was self-supporting. That meant open interior space that could be adapted for anything: sleeping quarters, mess halls, hospitals, command centers, or storage. This flexibility was as revolutionary as the design itself. By early spring 1942, the first prototype stood proudly at Quonset Point. Navy officers tested them against simulated wind loads, heavy rain, and rapid assembly drills. The verdict came quickly: success. The huts were easy to build, solid under stress, and capable of surviving the worst the Pacific could throw at them. Production began immediately, with the George A. Fuller Company contracted to manufacture the first 10,000 units. Before the year was out, factories across the United States were stamping out steel ribs, corrugated panels, and plywood ends by the thousands. The Quonset hut was no longer just a design. It was a machine in motion. The logistical advantages were astounding. Each hut was shipped as a flat-packed kit weighing under 2 tons, small enough for trucks or cargo ships. The crates contained every bolt, plate, and instruction sheet needed to raise the structure in the field. For soldiers accustomed to chaos, the simplicity was almost miraculous. A squad could arrive on a muddy beach in the morning, open their crates, and sleep under a solid roof by nightfall. No heavy machinery, no specialized training, just human effort and clear design. As the Pacific campaign intensified, the huts began to appear everywhere. They dotted the coastlines of Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa like metallic seashells, gleaming under tropical suns or buried beneath jungle canopies. They became the instant cities of war. Barracks, hospitals, workshops, offices, and chapels, each one identical in form, but unique in purpose. And they endured everything, from bomb shrapnel to typhoon force winds. In some cases, entire Quonset villages were flattened by air raids, only to be rebuilt by the same men within days. The huts became symbols of resilience, not just for what they housed, but for what they represented, the power of human ingenuity under impossible conditions. The troops who lived in them gave mixed reviews. Some joked that the huts turned into ovens under midday sun or rattled like drums in the rain. But despite the discomforts, there was an unspoken affection. The curved steel walls, painted dull olive or camouflage gray, became familiar silhouettes against the foreign skies of the Pacific. For many servicemen, the Quonset hut was the one constant in an ever-changing war. By 1943, the Quonset hut had evolved into multiple variants, different lengths, insulation levels, and interior arrangements. Some models were fitted with raised wooden floors to keep out rainwater and insects. Others included ventilation fans or makeshift air conditioning for hospitals. Every new theater of war brought its own modifications, and the design adapted each time. The huts proved just as effective in the freezing cold of Alaska as in the sweltering humidity of the Solomon Islands. Their universal adaptability became one of their greatest triumphs, a structure born of a single urgent need now meeting hundreds of others. The Seabees, America's legendary construction battalions, were the ones who made the Quonset hut a living reality. They were sailors and builders, engineers and improvisers, often working under fire. Wherever the Marines landed, the Seabees followed, hauling crates of steel and plywood onto beaches still echoing with gunfire. They would stake out flat ground, hammer anchors into the soil, and begin raising those unmistakable arches of corrugated metal. Many of them joked that they could build a Quonset hut faster than the enemy could shell it. But behind the humor was something profound. These men were building not just shelters, but lifelines. Each hut meant command posts for strategy, hospitals for the wounded, and barracks for exhausted soldiers who had nowhere else to rest. One of the reasons the Quonset hut was so revolutionary was its simplicity. Each piece had a clear purpose, and each purpose had been tested in the field. The base plates were steel, secured by stakes or sandbags, preventing uplift from wind or shock waves. The ribs were semicircular, bolted together with pre-drilled holes that guaranteed alignment. The corrugated steel panels overlapped perfectly, shedding rain like the scales of a fish. Inside, insulation and a simple wooden lining helped regulate temperature. Primitive, but effective. It wasn't luxurious, but it worked. And in war, reliability is more precious than beauty. The hut's curved shape also gave it a strange, organic beauty. When viewed in rows, they looked like half-buried shells, blending into the landscapes of distant islands. To engineers, it was the perfect marriage of form and function. The semi-cylindrical geometry distributed loads evenly, eliminating weak points. A Quonset hut could shrug off winds that tore apart flat-roofed structures. When explosions shook the ground, the arches flexed and absorbed energy instead of collapsing. The huts didn't resist force by brute strength. They redirected it. That subtle insight, a lesson from both ancient architecture and modern material science, made all the difference. Yet the Quonset hut wasn't just an engineering marvel, it was also a masterpiece of logistics. During WWII, efficiency of supply was as crucial as firepower. The Navy needed buildings that could be produced, shipped, and erected faster than enemy advances. The Quonset hut's design turned construction into assembly. Factories on the American mainland, far from the front lines, stamped out panels and frames like automobile parts. Workers, many of them women, riveted, packed, and loaded the kits into rail cars. Every shipment contained exactly what was needed, nothing more, nothing less. Even the bolts were counted. The result was a system of building that blurred the line between architecture and manufacturing, a concept that would later revolutionize civilian construction. The first combat tests came quickly. In 1942, the huts arrived on Guadalcanal, one of the bloodiest campaigns of the Pacific War. The tropical storms there were legendary, weeks of rain followed by howling winds that could rip trees from the earth. The Quonset huts endured. Soldiers who had once slept in tents found themselves dry for the first time in months. One Marine wrote in his diary that he never thought steel could feel like home. It wasn't just shelter, it was sanity. When monsoon rains turned the island into a swamp, the huts stayed standing. When bombs fell, the curved roofs scattered shrapnel. When disease spread through the camps, they became clinics and isolation wards. As the war stretched on, the Quonset hut became as common as the jeep or the sea ration. On Iwo Jima, they were used as command centers where generals mapped out operations. On Tinian, they served as makeshift laboratories and briefing rooms for the B-29 crews that would carry out missions over Japan. On Okinawa, they became chapels where soldiers prayed amid chaos. The design was so successful that it spread beyond the Navy, used by the Army, Marines, and even Allied forces. Wherever the U.S. military went, the Quonset hut followed, its curved silhouette becoming part of the visual language of the war. And yet, for all its military precision, the Quonset hut had a human side. The soldiers who lived in them found ways to make them personal. They painted murals on the walls, built porches out of scrap lumber, hung hammocks between the arches, and planted small gardens out front. They nicknamed them tin cans, canned homes, or simply the huts. Inside, laughter and arguments, card games and letters home filled the curved space. The Quonset hut wasn't glamorous, but it was theirs. It represented stability amid chaos. For many servicemen, their memories of war are tied as much to those humble steel walls as to the battles outside. Behind the scenes, the engineers continued refining the design. There were multiple models, the most famous being the Quonset hut, 42 x 16, which became the standard barrack size. Variants followed: storage units, double-wide mess halls, and even super Quonsets for vehicle repair. Each iteration improved ventilation, insulation, and modular connection. What's remarkable is how these innovations foreshadowed the future of prefabricated architecture. They weren't thinking about peacetime housing, yet their work laid the groundwork for modern prefab homes, disaster relief structures, and mobile architecture decades later. The Quonset hut was ahead of its time. By 1944, the production lines had reached peak efficiency. Factories from New Jersey to California were producing parts at an astonishing rate. The assembly process was so standardized that even when parts from different plants were mixed together, they still fit perfectly. That level of interchangeability was rare in construction at the time. It was a triumph of industrial precision. Each hut, in essence, was a puzzle made of interchangeable pieces, capable of being rebuilt, repaired, or modified indefinitely. But perhaps the most dramatic tests of the Quonset huts came from nature itself. The Pacific is home to some of the most violent storms on Earth, and typhoons became unintentional stress tests. Soldiers recounted watching entire camps made of wooden shacks blow away while the Quonset huts remained. On Okinawa, after one devastating storm in 1945, engineers found that nearly all the Quonsets had survived intact, while other structures had disintegrated. The hut's curved geometry and low profile made them resistant to both uplift and drag, allowing the wind to flow smoothly over and around them instead of tearing them apart. They didn't fight the wind, they cooperated with it. Even in bombings, the huts showed surprising resilience. Though not armored, the curved metal surfaces deflected fragments and pressure waves better than flat walls. They weren't bomb shelters, but they often saved lives. Their simplicity meant that even when damaged, they could be repaired on the spot. Panels replaced, ribs rebolted, holes patched with sheet metal. To the engineers, it was proof of concept. To the soldiers, it was proof of survival. By war's end, more than 170,000 Quonset huts had been built. They spanned continents across Europe, Africa, Asia, and countless islands in between. Each one was a node in the global web of American logistics. The huts had done more than provide shelter. They had helped win the war. And yet, when peace finally came, their story was far from over. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945 and soldiers began returning home, the world found itself with an unexpected surplus of steel and ingenuity. Across the United States and its overseas bases, there stood tens of thousands of Quonset huts, sturdy, portable, and far too useful to scrap. The military decommissioned many of them, auctioning them off to civilians for as little as a few $100s. Almost overnight, these humble wartime shelters became the building blocks of post-war America. Farmers bought them to use as barns and storage sheds. Colleges used them as makeshift classrooms to house the sudden wave of returning GIs. Churches, diners, and small businesses sprang up inside curved steel shells that had once sheltered soldiers in the jungles of the Pacific. The Quonset hut was reborn for peace. What made the Quonset hut so adaptable was the same thing that made it a wartime miracle: simplicity. Its half-cylinder frame could be lengthened, shortened, insulated, or modified with minimal effort. A farmer in Kansas could turn one into a hay barn. A family in Oregon could turn another into a cozy home. A school in Texas could link several together to create an entire campus. The same structure that had endured monsoons and bombings was now hosting Sunday services and children's laughter. It was as if the spirit of resilience embedded in the design had found a new mission: to rebuild and rehouse a nation emerging from war. But the Quonset hut's influence extended far beyond American soil. Around the world, in the war-torn landscapes of Europe and Asia, the same design offered a lifeline. In Britain, France, and the Philippines, Quonset huts became part of reconstruction efforts. They served as refugee shelters, Red Cross clinics, and emergency housing for displaced families. Engineers in Japan and Korea studied their design and built their own versions, adapting them for local materials and climates. The Quonset hut had gone from being a symbol of military might to one of humanitarian aid. From an architectural standpoint, the Quonset hut represented a quiet revolution. For the first time, large-scale prefabrication had been proven not just possible, but practical. Before WWII, buildings were almost always constructed piece by piece on site, relying on skilled labor and complex materials. The Quonset hut flipped that model on its head. It was an early example of mass customization, the idea that identical parts could create infinite variations. By changing the length, end panels, or interior finishes, one could adapt the same design to nearly any purpose. This principle would go on to influence everything from suburban tract housing to space-age architecture. Of course, the design wasn't without critics. Some architects dismissed the Quonset hut as purely utilitarian, a stopgap solution with no artistic merit. They saw its corrugated steel as industrial and cold, its shape too simplistic. But others saw beauty in its efficiency. For architects like Buckminster Fuller and later Norman Foster, the Quonset hut symbolized the harmony between technology and humanity. It demonstrated that good design wasn't about ornamentation, it was about solving real problems elegantly. Fuller himself would go on to experiment with geodesic domes inspired in part by the structural logic of the Quonset's arch. In that sense, the humble hut was a stepping stone toward a new architectural philosophy: design for everyone, anywhere. By the late 1940s, America's landscape had become dotted with Quonset huts in every imaginable form. College campuses, swelling with veterans attending under the GI Bill, used them as lecture halls and dormitories. The University of Minnesota, Stanford, and many others built entire Quonset villages. On the West Coast, small towns saw them turned into diners and movie theaters. In the industrial heartland, they became garages, machine shops, and factories. Even in the suburbs, adventurous homeowners converted surplus huts into stylish, modern homes, adding glass fronts and wooden decks. To many, the Quonset represented something quintessentially American: practicality, adaptability, and self-reliance. Meanwhile, in the developing world, the Quonset hut continued its second life as a humanitarian tool. The United Nations and Red Cross used modified versions for disaster relief and refugee housing. Their portability and ease of assembly made them perfect for crises where speed was everything. In earthquake zones, flood regions, and war-torn cities, the Quonset's curved frame and modular assembly became a model for emergency shelter. Decades after its invention, it still fulfilled the Navy's original brief: a structure that could be built anywhere, by anyone. Engineers began experimenting with variations on the design: new materials, improved ventilation, and even inflatable versions for ultra-fast deployment. In the 1960s and 70s, lightweight aluminum and fiberglass Quonset-style buildings appeared, used for everything from radar stations to Antarctic research bases. The principles remained the same: prefabrication, portability, and strength through geometry. The Quonset hut had transcended its era. It had become a universal language of shelter. But the most fascinating evolution came in how people began to reinterpret the hut's meaning. In art and culture, the Quonset became a symbol of the post-war transition, a reminder of how wartime ingenuity could serve peacetime progress. Photographers captured rows of huts on misty fields, the steel arches gleaming like the ribs of a sleeping giant. Novelists and filmmakers used them as settings for stories about rebuilding, perseverance, and nostalgia. For many veterans, owning or living in a Quonset hut was deeply personal, a way of carrying a piece of the war's memory into civilian life. By the mid-20th century, Quonset huts had become part of American folklore. They were found on highways, in rural fields, and at the edges of cities. The design had inspired countless imitators. Butler buildings, Armco arched warehouses, and the later P-Series and S-Series steel structures that are still in production today. Even if the name Quonset faded from the public lexicon, its DNA lived on in modern construction. Every prefab hangar, curved greenhouse, or arched storage unit owes something to that original wartime invention. The engineering behind it remained as relevant as ever. The semicircular arch continued to be one of the most efficient structural forms known to man. It used material sparingly while offering maximum strength. The corrugated pattern, now common in roofing and shipping containers, had proven itself under the most brutal conditions imaginable. It was as if the Quonset hut had distilled architecture down to its most essential truth. That form follows function, and good design endures. In many ways, the Quonset hut was a product of its time, but not limited by it. It was born out of urgency, yet it outlived the war that created it. When viewed through a modern lens, it anticipated trends that would dominate 21st century architecture: sustainability, modularity, and resilience. Today, when architects design shelters for climate refugees or habitats for Mars missions, they are following the same principles first tested in 1942 on the windy coast of Rhode Island: simple parts, rapid assembly, and adaptability to extreme environments. Even NASA's engineers have looked back at the Quonset model for inspiration. The idea of a lightweight, prefabricated curved structure that could be shipped compactly and assembled on another planet echoes everything the original Navy designers envisioned. Whether on a coral island or the Martian surface, the goal remains the same: to create shelter that protects life under harsh conditions. That's the true legacy of the Quonset hut. It's not just a building, but a philosophy of survival. And yet, at its core, the Quonset hut was also a story about people, ordinary men and women who built, lived, and dreamed beneath its arched roof. From the Seabees hammering under fire to the families who turned them into homes, the Quonset hut connected worlds of war and peace. It proved that engineering is not just about steel and bolts, but about imagination, the ability to see not what exists, but what's possible. By the time the 1950s arrived, the Quonset hut had become a fixture of both memory and modern life. The same curved silhouettes that once lined battlefronts now lined highways, airfields, and farmland across America. They were a familiar sight, unassuming, practical, and enduring. Yet beneath their plain exteriors lay a deeper legacy. They embodied a transition between eras, from war to peace, from destruction to reconstruction, from improvisation to innovation. The Quonset hut was proof that necessity could spark creativity on a scale no one had anticipated. In small towns, surplus huts became symbols of the post-war boom. Returning veterans, equipped with GI Bill benefits and a newfound sense of confidence, began using the huts as the foundations for businesses. Mechanics turned them into auto shops. Farmers used them to store grain or machinery. In New Mexico and Arizona, artists and craftsmen found that the hut's open, column-free interiors were perfect for studios. Churches sprang up beneath their corrugated arches, echoing with hymns instead of artillery fire. The same shape that once sheltered soldiers in battle now sheltered hope and ambition. What made the Quonset hut so remarkable wasn't just its strength, but its versatility. The interior space, free of load-bearing walls, allowed infinite customization. Need an office? Install a partition. Need a home? Add insulation, windows, and a wood stove. The smooth curve of the ceiling created a sense of enclosure, yet openness, a cocoon of steel that felt both sturdy and strangely comforting. Architects who once dismissed the huts began to see potential in them. Some retrofitted them with glass fronts, transforming utilitarian shells into modernist homes that looked like something out of an architectural magazine. They were industrial on the outside, but surprisingly warm within, a paradox that captured the spirit of mid-century design. And the engineering behind it all remained as elegantly simple as ever. The Quonset structure relied on a perfect balance of tension and compression. The curved ribs bore the load downward and outward, distributing weight across the entire arch. This meant that even under heavy snow or high winds, the stress never concentrated in one spot. The corrugation with its repeating ridges acted like a series of tiny beams, reinforcing the metal's stiffness without adding significant weight. Together, these elements formed a structure that could survive conditions that would tear conventional buildings apart. It was an engineer's dream, maximum efficiency from minimal material. When typhoons battered the Pacific, when snow blanketed Korea, when tropical heat baked the Philippines, the huts endured. The U.S. military continued using them long after the war, constructing entire bases out of Quonset-style structures during the Korean War, and even into Vietnam. Their low cost and modularity made them indispensable. In some cases, they were adapted into radar domes, aircraft hangars, and communication stations. The design was flexible enough to evolve with technology, proving that simplicity could outlast even the rapid pace of innovation. At the same time, their civilian afterlife was reshaping communities in unexpected ways. In Alaska, they became trading posts and frontier homes. In Hawaii, they served as surfboard factories and beachside cafes. In rural Illinois, entire neighborhoods were built from surplus Quonsets, their curved roofs forming rows like iron waves. To people who had lived through years of rationing and uncertainty, these huts represented progress, a new kind of architecture born not from luxury but from practicality and endurance. They were democratic buildings, accessible to anyone who could afford a few $100s and some sweat equity. The huts also found their place in academia. During the baby boom, universities faced an influx of students far beyond their existing capacity. The Quonset hut provided a quick and affordable solution. At campuses from California to New York, these curved buildings became classrooms, libraries, and laboratories. Some students affectionately called them tin universities. They might not have had the grandeur of ivy-covered halls, but they had something more vital: adaptability. When demand grew, another hut could be added in a matter of days. Education, like war, required flexibility, and the Quonset delivered. In architectural circles, the hut's reputation began to shift. What was once dismissed as crude began to be studied as a model of efficient design. Its prefabrication methods anticipated modern modular construction. Its aerodynamic form foreshadowed the energy-conscious designs of later decades, and its reliance on mass production prefigured the sustainable building systems of today. In many ways, the Quonset hut was the grandfather of contemporary prefab housing, an uncelebrated ancestor of the modular home revolution. But beyond its technical achievements, the Quonset hut carried a human story that resonated deeply with those who experienced it. For the Seabees who built them under enemy fire, the huts were symbols of survival and ingenuity. For refugees who lived in them after the war, they were symbols of recovery and hope. For students who studied within their curved walls, they represented opportunity. Each one told a different story, but all shared a common thread: the triumph of human resourcefulness in the face of hardship. Perhaps one of the most fascinating aspects of the Quonset hut's history lies in how it bridged cultures and continents. In Japan, for example, American forces used them during the occupation period, and local builders soon adapted the design, giving rise to their own versions made from bamboo, wood, and tin. In Australia, modified Quonset huts became part of the post-war expansion, serving as temporary housing for immigrants and returning soldiers. The same was true in Europe, where displaced persons camps relied on similar prefabricated shelters. The Quonset design transcended borders, not because it was American, but because it was universal. It answered a question every society faces at some point: how do we build shelter quickly, affordably, and sustainably? Even as technology advanced, the fundamental logic of the Quonset hut refused to fade. By the 1960s, NASA, engineers studying lunar and Martian habitats, referenced its principles. A curved, pressurized structure capable of resisting external forces, it was the same physics applied to a new frontier. The idea that something born in the urgency of World War II could one day inspire designs for living on another planet is one of history's most poetic continuities. The hut that once defied typhoons might one day withstand solar storms on Mars. In many ways, the Quonset hut's longevity stems from its ability to adapt without losing its essence. Unlike most wartime technologies that became obsolete, it evolved naturally into peacetime applications. It was an early example of sustainable design, not because of environmentalism, but because of necessity. It made efficient use of materials, minimized waste, and maximized utility. It was repairable, recyclable, and reusable long before those terms became fashionable. In an age obsessed with novelty, the Quonset hut remained timeless. And still, decades later, many of them stand, weathered, rusted, but unbroken. You can find them on farms, in towns, even hidden behind new construction. Some have been converted into homes with skylights and solar panels. Others remain untouched relics of history, their steel ribs whispering stories of war and peace to those who pass by. Few designs in history have traveled such a journey, from battlefield to backyard, from emergency shelter to architectural icon. The Quonset hut didn't just endure, it transformed. It's easy to underestimate how much of the Quonset hut's success came from the mindset that created it. In 1942, the engineers who gathered at Quonset Point weren't simply designing a building, they were reimagining what construction could be under the harshest possible circumstances. They had no luxury of time, no tolerance for inefficiency, and no margin for error. Everything had to be calculated, refined, and tested with brutal honesty. A single flaw could mean the difference between life and death for the men who would live beneath those curved roofs. That intensity forged a design philosophy rooted in practicality, yet capable of poetry. It was architecture distilled to its purest form, shelter as survival. Those engineers understood something profound, that a good design should serve the user, not the other way around. They didn't design for aesthetics or prestige, they designed for endurance, speed, and adaptability. They knew that soldiers on the front lines would have neither cranes nor contractors. They'd have mud, sweat, and fear, and they needed a structure that respected that reality. Every bolt, every panel, every curve was conceived with empathy. That's why, decades later, architects still study the Quonset hut, not just for its engineering, but for its humanity. There was also a certain elegance in how the huts were made. The production lines were almost cinematic in their rhythm, sparks flying, steel sheets bending, under pressure, riveters hammering with mechanical precision. It was mass production with a moral purpose. The same factories that once produced automobiles and machinery now churned out buildings, each one a small miracle of industrial coordination. Men and women working long shifts in American factories knew their hands were building something that would protect soldiers across the world. The huts became physical extensions of home. Home shipped overseas in crates and assembled in foreign soil. And when those huts arrived at the front, they were often the first sign of permanence in chaos. For troops landing on beaches or clearing jungles, the sight of those corrugated arches rising from the mud meant safety was near. They were symbols of order, of structure amid destruction. Imagine being a young Marine after weeks of combat and rain, watching Seabees hammering steel under the tropical sun, knowing that by nightfall, you'd have a dry place to sleep. The psychological impact was enormous. The Quonset hut wasn't just a shelter, it was morale made tangible. As the war progressed, variations of the hut emerged to meet specific needs. Some were lengthened to house vehicles or aircraft parts. Others were insulated and fitted with windows to create field hospitals. The Super Quonset featured taller arches for storage depots and machine shops. There was even a Quonset Red Cross model designed as a mobile medical clinic. The adaptability was astonishing. Without altering the fundamental geometry, engineers could create entirely new types of spaces. It was proof of how powerful a simple form could be when guided by good design principles. The huts also taught invaluable lessons about logistics. Military planners realized that prefabrication could reduce construction time from weeks to hours. Instead of shipping raw materials and tools, they shipped complete systems. This efficiency saved lives, resources, and money. It also changed the way the military thought about infrastructure. Bases could now move with the front lines. Command centers could rise overnight. The world of architecture had entered a new age, the age of assembly rather than construction. This thinking would ripple far beyond the battlefield. After the war, the same principles fueled the rise of prefabricated housing in America. With millions of veterans returning home and a housing shortage at crisis levels, the government and private companies turned to mass production for answers. Factories that once built Quonset huts retooled to produce modular homes. The DNA of wartime innovation had entered peacetime industry. Even the famous Levittown suburbs, often seen as symbols of the post-war boom, owed a quiet debt to the Quonset's lessons in standardization and efficiency. Still, not everyone embraced the Quonset hut's utilitarian image. In cities, some saw them as temporary eyesores, reminders of war and scarcity. Yet others found beauty in their honesty. In a decade obsessed with modernism, where clean lines and functional design were celebrated, the Quonset fit perfectly. Its curved silhouette, once a mark of military necessity, became a symbol of modern simplicity. It represented an era that valued efficiency over excess, a design language that still resonates today. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, the huts continued to serve quietly across the world. In the Arctic, they housed researchers braving freezing winds. In tropical Africa, they served as schools and hospitals. On U.S. military bases, they became workshops and storage depots. Even as new materials like aluminum and fiberglass emerged, the classic steel Quonset remained dependable. Its formula was timeless: simplicity, modularity, and resilience. These were not just design features, they were values. Engineers studying their long-term performance made an interesting discovery. Many Quonset huts outlasted their intended lifespan by decades. Originally designed as temporary structures, they often stood strong for 40, 50, even 70 years with minimal maintenance. The galvanized coating protected against rust, the arch resisted deformation, and the lack of complex joints minimized wear. This longevity raised a fascinating question. Had the Navy accidentally designed one of the most durable buildings ever made? In architectural schools, students began revisiting the Quonset hut as a case study. It represented everything that good design should be: efficient, affordable, replicable, and elegant in its simplicity. It was also a testament to interdisciplinary collaboration. The hut wasn't the product of a lone genius, but of a collective effort between engineers, naval officers, and industrial designers. It stood as a model for how science and creativity could merge under pressure to create something enduring. By the late 20th century, the Quonset hut had become part of the cultural landscape. Musicians rehearsed in them, artists painted in them, entrepreneurs launched startups inside them. In a strange twist, the very structure that symbolized military precision had become a haven for free expression. In some cities, artists reclaimed old Quonset huts as studios and galleries, celebrating their rugged character and history. The corrugated walls, once polished and uniform, now bore graffiti and murals, a new kind of life for a building that refused to die. Even today, walking into an old Quonset hut feels different. The air echoes softly, curving along the steel ceiling. Sunlight filters through small vents or gaps, tracing gentle arcs on the floor. The sound of footsteps is amplified, almost musical. You can feel the structure's history in the way it breathes, in the coolness of its walls. It's not just a relic, it's a survivor. And like any survivor, it carries stories of war and peace, of invention and endurance, of people who refuse to accept the impossible. The legacy of the Quonset hut is a reminder that design doesn't need to be extravagant to be extraordinary. Sometimes the most powerful creations come from constraint, from being forced to solve problems with limited time and resources. The Quonset hut is proof that beauty can emerge from urgency and that strength can arise from simplicity. It embodies the spirit of engineering at its best: practical, humble, and quietly transformative. As the decades rolled on, the Quonset hut began to acquire an almost mythic status among engineers and historians alike. It became more than a building, it became a symbol of resilience, of how design under pressure can yield timeless results. Even as sleek skyscrapers and modern materials transformed city skylines, the humble hut remained, standing in quiet defiance of obsolescence. It was not polished or glamorous, but it endured. In many ways, the Quonset hut represented the essence of the 20th century, born of war, adapted for peace, and sustained by ingenuity. In the post-war years, new companies emerged to continue the tradition. Armco Steel, Butler Manufacturing, and other firms began producing civilian versions of the Quonset hut, refining the design for agriculture, aviation, and industry. These commercial successors adopted the same arched shape, but introduced innovations like reinforced trusses, larger spans, and improved insulation. Farmers across the Midwest began using them as barns and grain silos, their curved profiles dotting the horizon. Airfields replaced hangars with Quonset-style shelters that could withstand both snow loads and crosswinds. Even oil companies used them as field stations in remote regions. The design's adaptability made it as relevant in 1960 as it had been in 1942. The durability of the Quonset hut also turned it into an icon of the American landscape. Photographers and documentarians began to capture them as symbols of endurance and nostalgia. They stood on old airstrips, overgrown with grass, or in dusty fields, where their corrugated sides shimmered like armor in the sun. Some had been abandoned, yet still stood tall. Others had been lovingly restored, their interiors converted into workshops or studios. Each one was a time capsule, a reminder of a moment when necessity demanded brilliance. For engineers, the continued survival of these huts offered valuable lessons about material science and load distribution. The combination of corrugated steel and the arch form proved to be one of the most efficient uses of material ever devised. Studies conducted decades later showed that pound for pound, the Quonset hut's structural efficiency rivaled that of modern aerospace components. Its shape was inherently stable, requiring no internal supports. This meant fewer points of failure and less material waste. The design's simplicity made it not only cheap but sustainable, long before the term entered the architectural vocabulary. In classrooms and design studios, architecture students began revisiting the Quonset hut as a case study in minimalism. Professors would challenge their students to improve upon the design. Few could. The truth was that the Quonset hut had already achieved near-perfect balance between form and function. Its shape, derived from pure geometry, obeyed natural laws that remained constant regardless of era. Whether made of steel, aluminum, or composite materials, the principle was the same: curved strength through distributed stress. Even as architectural trends evolved toward glass towers and modular blocks, the Quonset's DNA persisted. Its influence could be traced in everything from geodesic domes to aircraft hangars to the tensile fabric structures used in modern stadiums. When Buckminster Fuller introduced his geodesic dome in the 1950s, he acknowledged the inspiration drawn from the wartime ingenuity of structures like the Quonset hut. Both designs shared the same ethos: achieve maximum strength with minimal material, use geometry as the backbone of stability, and make construction accessible to ordinary people. Culturally, the Quonset hut remained embedded in the American psyche. It appeared in movies, novels, and even comic books, often as a backdrop for stories of hard work and endurance. It symbolized grit, resourcefulness, and the optimism of post-war life. In some rural communities, Quonset huts became gathering spaces: local halls, roller rinks, and community theaters. Children played under their arched ceilings, unaware that the very structure protecting them had once stood in the path of bombs and storms. The transformation from war machine to community space gave the Quonset a uniquely human dimension. Internationally, the design's adaptability continued to find new applications. In Africa and Asia, aid organizations used Quonset-style buildings for field hospitals and schools. The simplicity of assembly made them ideal for areas with limited resources. In South America, they became storage units for coffee and grain. Even in the harsh deserts of the Middle East, where extreme heat tested the limits of materials, the Quonset hut performed admirably. With proper ventilation, it remained cooler than most traditional structures, its reflective steel shedding solar radiation. Engineers marveled at how a design born in a Rhode Island shipyard had conquered climates across the planet. By the late 20th century, a new generation of architects began to rediscover the Quonset hut as a sustainable building model. As environmental awareness grew, so did appreciation for its efficiency. The design required fewer materials, generated less waste, and could be constructed with minimal energy input. Some builders began creating neo-Quonsets, updating the classic form with recycled steel, solar panels, and green insulation. These modern interpretations retained the same recognizable curve but paired it with contemporary comfort. It was as if the spirit of 1942 had been reborn for the age of sustainability. But even as it evolved, the Quonset hut never lost its original soul. It remained at its core a structure of necessity, a reminder that the greatest innovations often emerge not from abundance, but from constraint. When resources are scarce and time is short, creativity thrives. The engineers of World War II didn't set out to change architecture forever. They simply needed to solve a problem. And in doing so, they created a design so efficient, so adaptable, that it continues to serve humanity 8 decades later. Perhaps the most poetic part of the Quonset hut's legacy is its persistence in unexpected places. In rural Alaska, isolated Quonsets stand half buried in snow, their curved roofs gleaming faintly under the northern lights. In the South Pacific, jungle vines creep across forgotten huts, their rusting arches blending into the greenery. In America's heartland, old Quonsets sit beside barns and silos, still used for storage or workshops. Some have been converted into homes, others into breweries or artist spaces. Each one is a quiet monument to an era when engineering served a higher purpose: to protect, to endure, to adapt. Even the name Quonset, once merely a geographic label, has taken on mythic weight. It evokes a specific time and place, a sense of ingenuity under fire. Quonset Point, Rhode Island, where it all began, has become a historical site, its legacy preserved by veterans groups and engineers who understand the significance of what was accomplished there. Standing on that ground today, one can almost hear the echo of hammers, the clatter of steel, and the quiet determination of the men who built a miracle in 60 days. When you think about it, few inventions from that era have maintained such relevance. The Jeep, the C-47 airplane, and the Quonset hut, all products of wartime necessity, continue to inspire design thinking. They were tools for survival that became icons of adaptability. The Quonset hut, in particular, bridges the worlds of engineering and art, of science and humanity. It proves that even in the darkest moments of history, creativity can forge structures not just of steel, but of hope. In the 21st century, as humanity faces new challenges, climate change, displacement, and the need for sustainable housing, the lessons of the Quonset hut feel newly urgent. Its design reminds us that simplicity and strength are not opposites, but allies. It shows that good engineering is timeless and that solutions born in crisis can light the way forward. The Quonset hut may have been built for war, but its true legacy is peace, the enduring shelter of human ingenuity. The brilliance of the Quonset hut lay not just in its forms or its function, but in how it unified so many different disciplines. It was engineering, architecture, logistics, and even psychology, all rolled into one curved shell of steel. For the men who designed it, there was no separation between aesthetics and performance. Every decision, from the arc's radius to the thickness of the panels, was dictated by necessity, yet the result possessed a beauty born of purpose. It's one of those rare creations where form truly follows function so perfectly that the result transcends both. When engineers at Quonset Point drafted those first blueprints, they likely couldn't imagine how far their design would travel. Within months, the hut stood from the coral beaches of Tarawa to the volcanic soil of Iwo Jima, from the humid jungles of the Philippines to the frozen tundra of the Aleutians. In every climate, they adapted. They resisted rot where wood would have decayed, deflected wind where tents would have torn, and stayed standing when everything else around them was flattened. The huts didn't dominate their environments, they harmonized with them. Their curved shape let nature's forces glide around them instead of smashing against them. That subtle cooperation with the elements became a defining lesson in architectural resilience. To appreciate what a breakthrough this was, you have to imagine the conditions of the Pacific Campaign. Soldiers weren't fighting in cities or developed areas. They were landing on remote islands, often with no infrastructure at all. The tropical rains could last for days, turning everything into mud. The heat was relentless, the humidity unbearable, and the storms terrifying. Tents rotted, wooden buildings collapsed, and metal rusted almost overnight. In that chaos, the Quonset hut was a revelation. It could be shipped in crates, assembled quickly, and stand strong against nature's fury. It didn't just house people. It created stability in an environment defined by uncertainty. The Seabees understood that more than anyone. They were the hands that turned the engineer's vision into reality. These were men who fought and built at the same time, whose motto, "We build, we fight," captured the duality of their mission. On countless beaches, they unloaded crates stamped with assembly numbers, bolted ribs together in the rain, and raised those arches even as shells whistled overhead. Each hut they built was a small act of defiance, a statement that no matter how fierce the battle, order could still emerge from chaos. The Seabees became legends not only for their bravery, but for their creativity. They learned to modify the huts on the fly, extending them, reinforcing them, or linking them together to create entire complexes. Hospitals, command posts, storage depots, whole villages built from corrugated steel and ingenuity. One Seabee recalled in an interview years later that constructing Quonset huts felt like building civilization itself. In a sense, he was right. Every time they erected a new structure, they were reclaiming space from destruction. They weren't just constructing shelters, they were rebuilding humanity in the middle of war. For the troops who arrived at those bases, the sight of a Quonset hut on the horizon often meant safety, supplies, or even a hot meal. It was the architecture of reassurance, and the huts weren't limited to the Pacific. They appeared across every theater of war. In Europe, they sheltered engineers and logistics units after the D-Day landings. In North Africa, they became field workshops for tank repairs. In the frigid Aleutians, they were insulated and anchored to survive blizzards. The design proved as versatile in snow as in sand. In fact, some of the earliest lessons in cold weather engineering came from those Alaskan huts, where soldiers learned to add double walls, ventilation flaps, and insulated flooring. The modularity of the Quonset meant you could adapt it to any condition simply by changing a few components, a rare flexibility that still inspires architects designing for extreme environments today. After the war, when those huts were decommissioned, many Seabees bought them back at auction. They brought them home, rebuilt them on farms or in towns, and used them to start new lives. Some used them as garages, others as grocery stores or churches. To these veterans, the Quonset wasn't just a building, it was a friend, a symbol of resilience that had protected them through the worst days of their lives. Turning it into something new was almost a ritual of healing. Across the United States, entire communities rose from surplus military huts, giving them a second life far removed from the sound of artillery. In rural areas, they became a cornerstone of the self-reliant American spirit. Farmers admired them for their practicality, cheap, strong, and easy to maintain. Artists and craftsmen loved them for their openness and light. Some towns even developed their own distinctive local variants, painting the steel in bright colors or adding custom porches and windows. It was architecture for everyone, affordable, functional, and deeply personal. The Quonset hut may have been born from a military need, but it democratized design in a way few other inventions ever have. Architectural critics began to take notice. In the 1950s, magazines like Architectural Forum and Popular Mechanics featured stories about how ordinary Americans were transforming military huts into homes and businesses. One article marveled that the war's most temporary structure has become one of peace's most permanent symbols. Scholars studying modernism pointed out how the hut's minimalist ethos mirrored the artistic movements of the era: clean lines, honest materials, and a rejection of excess. The Quonset hut, once dismissed as crude, was suddenly being recognized as a forerunner of modern architectural thinking. Meanwhile, governments and humanitarian organizations around the world adopted similar principles for housing and disaster relief. When earthquakes, floods, or wars displaced thousands, engineers returned to the same question that had driven the Quonset's invention: how do you build quickly, affordably, and safely? From post-war Europe to modern refugee camps, the echoes of the Quonset hut can be found in every prefabricated shelter, every modular emergency structure. Its influence runs quietly but deeply through the veins of global humanitarian design. Perhaps one of the most enduring legacies of the Quonset hut is how it redefined what temporary means. It was conceived as a stopgap measure, expected to last a few years at most. Yet many huts built in 1943 still stand today, their corrugated skins faded but firm. They've survived hurricanes, snowstorms, earthquakes, and decades of neglect. Some have outlived the men who built them. There's something profoundly poetic about that, a temporary structure that became eternal through sheer resilience. It's as if the Quonset hut refused to accept the limits imposed on it, much like the people it once sheltered. That longevity also sparked a wave of preservation efforts. Across the United States, historical societies and veterans groups began restoring old Quonset huts, recognizing them as architectural and cultural landmarks. Museums dedicated to the Seabees and the Navy's engineering heritage often feature reconstructed huts, complete with original wartime furniture and tools. Visitors can step inside and experience the sensation of standing beneath that perfect curve, the same curve that once shielded men from storms and bombs. For many, it's a humbling reminder of how design can bridge the gap between survival and memory. And even now, architects continue to reinterpret the Quonset hut for the modern era. Contemporary versions feature high-performance insulation, skylights, and green roofs. Some are luxury homes, others serve as eco-lodges or co-working spaces. Yet despite the modern upgrades, the essence remains unchanged. That curved geometry, that straightforward assembly, that spirit of practicality, all endure. The Quonset hut doesn't belong to any single period or style. It exists outside of fashion, timeless in its utility. In that way, it mirrors humanity's own resilience. The hut's story is our story, the constant struggle to adapt, to survive, to rebuild. It stands as a monument to the idea that strength doesn't always roar. It can also hum quietly beneath a corrugated roof, sheltering those who dare to keep moving forward. When we step back and look at the story of the Quonset hut as a whole, it begins to resemble a parable about the relationship between humanity and technology. It's a story of how the pressure of war, the desperation of survival, and the limits of time and resources combine to produce something profoundly lasting. The hut was never intended to be beautiful, yet it is. Never meant to be eternal, yet it endures. What makes it even more remarkable is how it became a bridge between military necessity and civilian innovation, a literal crossover from destruction to creation. The 1940s were an era of radical invention. Across every field, engineers and scientists were racing to solve urgent problems. How to feed armies, transport them, and protect them. The Quonset hut emerged from that same crucible of creativity. Yet, unlike so many wartime technologies, like radar, jet engines, or nuclear power, it was built not to destroy, but to preserve. It was, in essence, a peace machine built during war. That duality gives the Quonset hut a moral dimension rarely found in engineering stories. It's not just about efficiency or physics, it's about empathy. The understanding that design must serve human life above all else. When the first prototypes were tested at Quonset Point, Rhode Island, the engineers conducted an array of rigorous trials. They subjected the huts to simulated storms, temperature extremes, and even controlled explosions to test resilience. One naval report noted how the arch design absorbed shock waves rather than resisting them head-on. The curvature redirected pressure, dissipating energy across the structure rather than concentrating it at a single point. In engineering terms, this meant exceptional blast resistance. In human terms, it meant survival. It was elegant physics, nature's own mathematics translated into steel. The team's approach also marked one of the earliest uses of system-level thinking in design. They didn't just create a building, they created a building kit, a complete logistical ecosystem. The Quonset hut could be manufactured, shipped, assembled, disassembled, and reassembled anywhere in the world. That cradle-to-grave design philosophy would become the foundation for modern prefab construction. In some ways, the Quonset hut anticipated the modular design strategies that now dominate global manufacturing. From smartphones to automobiles to IKEA furniture, every bolt and beam had its place in a coherent, repeatable system. At the time, the speed of production was unprecedented. Once the design was finalized, factories across America were retooled within weeks to produce the huts on an industrial scale. Workers assembled, packed, and shipped thousands every month. The process blurred the line between architecture and mass production, turning building into a form of assembly line engineering. This shift changed how people thought about architecture itself. For centuries, buildings had been handcrafted, unique, slow, and location-specific. The Quonset hut challenged that idea, proving that a structure could be both mass-produced and meaningful. It was architecture for the modern world, scalable, adaptable, and efficient. By 1943, these huts had become ubiquitous. They appeared in every war zone, every naval base, every forward command post. Pilots slept in them before missions, medics treated the wounded inside them, and generals planned invasions beneath their curved roofs. They became the silent witnesses to history, humble structures that housed the machinery of victory. In photographs of the Pacific Theater, rows of Quonset huts stretch into the horizon like metallic waves, each one a heartbeat in the logistics network that sustained the Allied war effort. Without them, the infrastructure of the war, the supply depots, hospitals, and workshops, might have faltered. They weren't glamorous, but they were essential. And then, when the war ended, they refused to disappear. In that refusal lies one of the most extraordinary second acts in architectural history. The government began selling them off as surplus, often at prices anyone could afford. For many returning veterans, the Quonset hut was their ticket to rebuilding life. Couples married in them, families moved into them, and entrepreneurs launched small businesses under those familiar curved ceilings. A structure born in the chaos of battle had become a foundation for peace. It was almost poetic, the tools of war turned into instruments of reconstruction. In some cases, entire communities sprang up from these surplus huts. On the edges of cities, people built neighborhoods of Quonsets, connecting them with wooden breezeways, painting them in pastel colors, and planting gardens around their steel shells. To outsiders, these settlements looked strange, like remnants of some futuristic dream. But to those who lived there, they represented freedom and possibility. For the first time, home ownership was within reach for ordinary people. The Quonset's affordability democratized space in a way few architectural movements ever have. It's important to recognize that this transformation wasn't just a matter of practicality, it was symbolic. The Quonset hut became a metaphor for a generation's resilience. Soldiers who had survived unimaginable hardship came home and turned war shelters into homes and schools. They reimagined something built for survival as something built for life. That act of transformation, taking an object of war and giving it a peaceful purpose, speaks to the best of human nature. As America modernized, the Quonset hut found new identities. On college campuses, they became classrooms for a flood of GI Bill students. In growing towns, they became auditoriums, skating rinks, and markets. Some even housed libraries and art studios. And in each of these reincarnations, the essential spirit of the design remained unchanged: fast to build, simple to maintain, endlessly adaptable. The Quonset hut had transcended its origin to become a universal language of shelter. Architecturally, scholars began to see in the Quonset hut a profound expression of modernist ideals. It was architecture stripped of ornament, focused entirely on function. Yet within that simplicity lay a kind of purity that appealed to the modernist sensibility. The Quonset hut didn't pretend to be anything other than what it was: steel, wood, and purpose. It stood as a rejection of excess, a celebration of honest design. In many ways, it foreshadowed the minimalist movement of the late 20th century, where less truly became more. But beyond design theory, the Quonset hut carried emotional weight. For millions, it was a reminder of endurance, of building something out of nothing. Its presence in post-war America was a physical embodiment of recovery. Veterans could point to a hut and say, "We lived in one of those on Okinawa," or "That's what we built after the invasion." It connected them to their past while helping them build a future. No other building, not even the famous skyscrapers of the age, held such deeply personal associations across so many lives. The hut's legacy also endured internationally. In places like Japan, where U.S. forces maintained bases after the war, the Quonset hut became a fixture of the landscape. Japanese architects studied its efficiency and began incorporating similar ideas into post-war reconstruction projects. The idea of prefabrication, once alien to traditional craftsmanship, became central to rebuilding cities devastated by bombing. The same was true in Europe, where reconstruction efforts demanded speed and economy. Across continents, the Quonset hut taught the world that resilience could be engineered. Its influence even touched space exploration. By the 1960s, when NASA engineers began designing habitats for the Moon and Mars, they drew directly from the principles of the Quonset hut: lightweight prefabrication, modularity, and the strength of curved geometry. The same logic that allowed huts to withstand Pacific typhoons now informed designs meant to resist lunar radiation and Martian dust storms. It's an extraordinary lineage, from wartime necessity to interplanetary architecture. The hut that protected soldiers under tropical rain might one day protect astronauts under alien skies. As the 20th century advanced, new materials emerged: aluminum alloys, composite polymers, and high-tensile fabrics. But the essential form of the Quonset hut persisted. Its shape was too efficient, too rational to abandon. Even in an age of digital design and computer-aided modeling, the arch remained unmatched in strength-to-weight ratio. The more technology advanced, the more the Quonset's original genius stood out. Sometimes the simplest solutions, forged under the greatest pressure, proved to be the most enduring. Through the passing decades, the Quonset hut story became less about its military origins and more about its quiet endurance in the fabric of everyday life. By the 1970s, many people didn't even know where the design had come from. They simply knew it worked. The huts had slipped seamlessly into the landscape: industrial parks, farms, backyards, and airfields, blending utility with familiarity. They were neither monuments nor relics. They were part of life, sturdy and dependable. And that, perhaps, was their greatest success. True design immortality is not found in fame, but in function. Yet behind that ordinariness was an extraordinary truth. No other wartime invention had achieved such a peaceful afterlife. Most weapons, machines, and technologies born of conflict either vanished or evolved into tools of greater destruction. The Quonset hut, however, became the opposite. It turned from a device of war logistics into a vessel of creativity, commerce, and community. What started as a solution for survival became a stage for human possibility. The very shape that once shielded soldiers now sheltered dreamers, farmers, artists, and families. By the 1980s, architects and historians began revisiting the Quonset hut's cultural significance. It had outlasted most of its contemporaries, and its footprint could be found from California deserts to Arctic outposts. Architectural historians like John Peter and Rainer Banham began to reference it in discussions about modernism and vernacular design. Banham, who celebrated utilitarian architecture, once wrote that the Quonset hut represented a pure conversation between need and form. It was a statement stripped of pretense, a building that existed purely because it was needed, and that very honesty made it beautiful. Meanwhile, in popular culture, the Quonset hut acquired a sort of nostalgic charm. In films and television shows set during World War II or the post-war era, its curved roof became visual shorthand for that period. Whether in war dramas or small-town stories, its image evoked endurance and simplicity. Some directors used it symbolically, as a metaphor for protection, or as a reminder of the industrial heart that powered America through both war and peace. The same way a single Jeep could signify resilience, a single Quonset hut could represent the strength of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. In the world of construction and architecture, the Quonset hut continued to evolve. Companies began producing improved models with larger spans and taller arches. Some versions eliminated the need for end walls altogether, creating massive open spaces ideal for storage, aircraft hangars, or manufacturing. These super Quonsets could stretch hundreds of feet in length, proving that the original design principles were scalable. Others were miniaturized for backyard workshops and garages. The beauty of the design was its universality. It could be scaled up or down without losing efficiency. The hut's adaptability also aligned perfectly with the changing needs of a post-industrial society. As cities expanded and space became expensive, people rediscovered the appeal of the Quonset's minimal footprint. Its simple foundation and modular nature made it easy to install on undeveloped land. The curved shape offered natural drainage and excellent wind resistance, valuable traits in both rural and urban environments. For small business owners and entrepreneurs, it was the ultimate low-cost, high-utility solution. You could start a factory, a car shop, or a warehouse in a matter of days. In that sense, the Quonset hut became an unsung catalyst of small-scale economic growth. Environmentalists, too, found lessons in the design. The structure's energy efficiency came from its geometry rather than expensive technology. The arch minimized exposed surface area, reducing heat loss in winter and heat gain in summer. With added insulation and ventilation, it created a surprisingly comfortable interior climate. Decades before sustainability became a buzzword, the Quonset hut embodied it intuitively. It was proof that good engineering naturally tends toward environmental harmony when guided by simplicity. Even as the architectural world pushed toward more complex forms and computerized design, the Quonset hut quietly persisted as a counterpoint, a reminder that innovation doesn't always mean complication. Its humble materials and honest construction offered a kind of antidote to excess. In an age of glass towers and sprawling suburbs, the hut stood as a relic of restraint. It spoke to a time when building was an act of necessity, not indulgence. And yet, even stripped of ornament, it possessed an unmistakable dignity. Many of the huts built during and after World War II were still in use 40 or 50 years later, often with little maintenance. In places like Hawaii, the Philippines, and the American South, you could drive past one and recognize instantly that familiar silhouette, a half-cylinder of corrugated steel gleaming in the sunlight. Some were rusted, their paint faded, but they still held firm. They had survived hurricanes, earthquakes, and countless storms. Each one was a small triumph of geometry and grit. Around the same time, a new generation of designers began to explore how the Quonset hut could fit into modern aesthetics. Architects experimented with glass-paneled end walls, skylights, and open-plan interiors. Some created minimalist homes that celebrated the structure's industrial roots, blending raw steel with wood and concrete. Others took a more artistic approach, transforming huts into cafes, galleries, and studios. The curved interior lent itself to creativity, a space that invited experimentation and adaptation. Once again, the Quonset hut proved it could evolve with the times. Interestingly, many architects found that the Quonset hut's shape had a psychological comfort to it. The continuous curve felt protective, enclosing without feeling oppressive. The lack of corners created a sense of flow, of unity. People described the interior as quietly calming, a feeling perhaps rooted in the way sound and light moved within the space. The very geometry that made it strong also made it soothing. In that sense, the hut wasn't just an engineering marvel, it was a kind of architectural empathy, wrapping its occupants in safety and simplicity. In rural areas, Quonset huts became multi-generational landmarks. A farmer might tell his children how their grandfather bought the hut after the war, how it once housed tractors, then grain, and later tools. It became part of family history. And because the huts required so little upkeep, they often stood unchanged for decades, silent witnesses to the passage of time. Each one was a chronicle of labor, adaptation, and perseverance. In communities across America, they became as familiar as barns or silos, yet their origin story remained extraordinary. Meanwhile, historians of technology began to recognize the Quonset hut as a turning point in the evolution of prefabrication. Before it, the idea of mass-producing entire buildings was radical. After it, it became normal. Everything from post-war housing developments to mobile classrooms and modern shipping container homes can trace their conceptual lineage to that 60-day project in Rhode Island. The Quonset hut had opened a door, one that would lead to entire industries built around modular design. Its influence even extended to fields far beyond architecture. Industrial designers, fascinated by its clean curves and mechanical efficiency, adopted similar forms in furniture, vehicles, and consumer goods. The streamlined aesthetic of the mid-20th century, from Airstream trailers to diner booths, carries echoes of the Quonset's corrugated rhythm. It became a cultural archetype, the arch as a symbol of progress, endurance, and optimism. By the close of the 20th century, the Quonset hut had achieved what few inventions ever do: ubiquity without obsolescence. It wasn't confined to museums or nostalgia. It remained alive, evolving quietly in new contexts. Whether as an airplane hangar in Alaska, a brewery in Oregon, or an artist's studio in Brooklyn, the same simple form continued to serve. It asked for little and gave back much. It was, and remains, one of the purest expressions of functional design ever created. By the dawn of the 21st century, the Quonset hut had already lived several lifetimes. What had begun as a wartime invention in 1942 had by now become a multi-generational constant, a design that outlasted empires, ideologies, and even the very conflicts that birthed it. Yet its relevance was far from fading. Instead, it found itself entering a new chapter, one defined not by war or reconstruction, but by sustainability, resilience, and global adaptation. The world once again was facing crises that demanded the very principles upon which the Quonset hut had been built. Climate change, natural disasters, and humanitarian emergencies created a renewed demand for fast, reliable, and affordable shelter. Engineers and architects found themselves grappling with the same problems their predecessors faced in 1942: how to build quickly in hostile environments using limited resources. And once again, the humble principles of the Quonset hut offered answers. Relief organizations such as the Red Cross and UNHCR began revisiting prefabricated arch-based structures for disaster housing, inspired directly by the Quonset's simplicity. Its ease of transport, minimal material use, and self-supporting design made it ideal for emergency deployment. In a strange echo of history, the same geometry that once protected soldiers from bombs was now shielding families from floods, earthquakes, and hurricanes. Meanwhile, in the civilian world, the Quonset hut experienced a renaissance in architecture and design culture. Across North America, Europe, and parts of Asia, people began converting old military huts into chic modern spaces. Architects who once studied them in textbooks now turned them into art. Their transformations were astonishing. Former storage sheds reborn as cozy homes with glass facades, rusting war relics transformed into airy coffee shops or craft breweries. In these reinventions, the Quonset hut shed its utilitarian past and embraced something new, an industrial elegance that resonated with the modern appreciation for minimalism and authenticity. This rebirth wasn't just aesthetic, it was philosophical. In an age of environmental anxiety and rapid consumption, the Quonset hut stood as a quiet rebuke to excess. Its design required no decoration to justify itself. Its strength came not from thickness or weight, but from geometry. Its efficiency was inherent, not engineered through costly technology. In the same way ancient builders once looked to arches and domes for inspiration, modern sustainability advocates looked back at the Quonset hut as an example of how human intelligence could coexist with natural forces rather than fight them. In cities like Portland, Austin, and Toronto, architects began to incorporate Quonset-style designs into sustainable housing projects. Using recycled steel, passive ventilation, and solar arrays, they reimagined the classic arch for the modern era. The results were striking: energy-efficient homes that could withstand extreme weather and be assembled in days rather than months. Some eco-communities even used modular Quonset systems to create off-grid villages, relying on rainwater harvesting and solar power. The huts, once tools of war, had become symbols of ecological harmony. The circle had come full. On the other end of the spectrum, engineers working on space exploration found themselves rediscovering the same ideas. NASA and other agencies tasked with designing habitats for Mars. Missions studied the advantages of curved, pressurized structures. The physics of survival in space, withstanding radiation, micrometeorite impacts, and extreme temperatures, mirrored the physics of survival in war zones and disaster areas. The Quonset's design logic applied perfectly: a self-supporting shell, prefabricated components, easy assembly by non-experts. The notion that an 80-year-old design could one day shelter humans on another planet is a testament to its timeless ingenuity. Back on Earth, historians began to recognize the Quonset hut as more than an architectural curiosity. It was a cultural artifact. Museums dedicated to World War II, naval engineering, and industrial design began restoring and displaying original huts, complete with period-accurate interiors. Visitors could walk through them and imagine the clatter of tools, the scent of oil, and the hum of generators that once filled their walls. These exhibits captured something few artifacts could: the intimate human experience of engineering under pressure. Each rivet and bolt told a story not of luxury, but of survival. One particularly moving restoration project took place in the Pacific, on the island of Tinian, the same island where the U.S. military once assembled the atomic missions that ended the war. There, volunteers restored several Quonset huts as memorials, not to celebrate conflict, but to honor the lives that passed through those spaces. Veterans and locals alike described the sensation of stepping inside as overwhelming: a wave of memory, of heat, sound, and emotion. For many, the huts had become sacred spaces, witnesses to history's most transformative moments. But beyond nostalgia, the Quonset hut's influence continued to expand into everyday life. Its descendants, modern arched steel buildings, became standard across industries. Whether it's an airplane hangar, a sports dome, or a storage facility, the DNA of the Quonset hut is unmistakable. The engineering principles, curved strength, modularity, and prefabrication, still guide construction today. Even in high-tech architecture with its computer-generated forms and lightweight materials, the underlying logic remains the same: distribute stress through curvature, eliminate waste, and simplify assembly. In education, the Quonset hut became a case study in design efficiency. Architecture schools used it to teach the fundamentals of form, load distribution, and prefabrication. Engineering students analyzed it for lessons in materials science and aerodynamics. Its simplicity made it the perfect teaching tool. It was a structure anyone could understand, yet no one could easily improve upon. In many ways, it became the IMC2 of architecture, a simple formula with infinite implications. What's especially fascinating is how the Quonset hut also influenced the psychology of shelter. The feeling of being enclosed in an arch-shaped space with its gentle curve and even acoustics evokes a sense of safety. Anthropologists studying spatial perception have noted that people tend to feel calmer in domed or arched environments than in angular ones. Perhaps that's why so many people who lived in Quonset huts during the war remembered them fondly despite the hardships. They were spaces of protection in a world gone mad, and that emotional imprint never left them. As the 21st century progressed, the hut's meaning deepened even further. In an era defined by displacement, millions fleeing wars, disasters, and climate collapse, the world once again needed buildings that could be shipped, assembled, and inhabited quickly. The descendants of the Quonset hut reemerged as part of that response. Companies and humanitarian groups developed lightweight steel and composite shelters based on the same principles. They could be packed into containers, flown across oceans, and set up in hours. The lineage was clear: a straight line from the beaches of the Pacific to refugee camps in Syria or flood zones in Bangladesh. Even in advanced economies, the Quonset hut's efficiency remained irresistible. When the global housing crisis intensified in the 2010s and 2020s, some innovators looked backward to move forward. Architects proposed Quonset-style modular housing for homeless populations and affordable housing projects. They discovered that the design's simplicity wasn't just economical, it was humane. It offered dignity through functionality, a roof over one's head without unnecessary cost or delay. In that way, the Quonset hut continued to fulfill its original mission: to provide shelter under pressure, to meet need with grace. In cultural terms, the Quonset hut had transcended its origins. It was no longer just an artifact of war or a chapter in engineering history. It had become a metaphor for endurance, for adaptability, for the unbreakable relationship between human creativity and survival. It was a structure that reminded people that design, at its best, is not about prestige or luxury, but about empathy and ingenuity. Every curve, every bolt, every shadow it cast spoke of that truth. And so, the Quonset hut endures, on farms and airfields, in museums and memory, and perhaps someday, on distant worlds. 80 years after a small group of engineers faced an impossible challenge at Quonset Point, their creation still teaches us something profound. that great design is not the product of abundance, but of necessity, not the pursuit of beauty, but the creation of meaning. The deeper one delves into the story of the Quonset hut, the more it becomes clear that this structure represents something larger than a feat of engineering. It embodies a philosophy of survival. To understand that philosophy, we have to return to the minds of the engineers who conceived it. They were working in a world on fire, where the usual constraints of time and comfort were stripped away, leaving only the raw essence of necessity. Their brief was almost absurd. Build a shelter that could resist storms, heat, and bombs. That could be shipped in pieces, and that could be built by untrained men in a single day. It was an impossible riddle. Yet, instead of being paralyzed by the impossibility, they simplified. They asked not, "What can we build?" but "What can we remove?" In that subtraction lay their genius. Every element of the Quonset hut's design tells a story of intelligent restraint. The arch eliminated the need for interior supports, cutting down on material and labor. Corrugated steel replaced heavier materials without sacrificing strength. Standardized bolts and prefabricated panels removed complexity from assembly. Even the decision to make the ends from plywood rather than metal wasn't a compromise. It was an optimization. It reduced shipping weight and allowed for easy customization in the field. The engineers didn't chase perfection. They chased function. And through function, they accidentally achieved something close to perfection. That mindset of reducing a problem to its simplest solvable form would become one of the defining traits of 20th century design. The Quonset hut anticipated an entire movement in engineering and architecture that favored clarity over ornament. It was, in a sense, the Bauhaus of the battlefield. Its beauty came from precision, not decoration, and in doing so, it foreshadowed the future, the rise of prefabrication, modular housing, and the minimalist ideals that would dominate global design philosophy decades later. The material science behind the hut was also revolutionary for its time. Corrugated steel had existed for decades, but it had rarely been used in this way. The engineers realized that by combining the wave-like pattern of corrugation with a semicircular arch, they could create a structure that defied the normal limits of thin-gauge metal. The corrugation added stiffness, distributing stress across hundreds of tiny ridges, while the arch transferred the load evenly into the ground. The result was an almost indestructible geometry, one that could flex slightly under pressure without breaking. This principle is now fundamental to modern structural engineering. In aircraft fuselages, bridges, and even skyscraper skins, the same concept, strength through controlled flexibility, remains in use. But while the engineering was brilliant, it was the human dimension that made the Quonset hut legendary. On the front lines, these structures became sanctuaries. Soldiers often described the sound of rain drumming on the steel roof as comforting, a rhythm that drowned out the chaos outside. Inside, they created makeshift homes. Photographs from the Pacific show huts filled with hammocks, radios, personal trinkets, and hand-painted signs. Some soldiers even gave their huts names: the Palace, the Ritz, Fort Boredom. In those names, one can hear the humor and humanity of men trying to find normalcy in the most abnormal circumstances. The Quonset hut became more than a building. It became a psychological shield. The Navy Seabees, who assembled most of them, became folk heroes in their own right. They were engineers, carpenters, and mechanics, builders who carried rifles. Their motto, "Can Do," wasn't just a slogan. It was a way of life. The Seabees could arrive on a devastated island, clear the debris, and within 24 hours raise an entire functioning base. They built airstrips, hospitals, mess halls, and barracks, all from the same kit. They worked through storms and under fire, often improvising with whatever materials were on hand. In their hands, the Quonset hut became a symbol of defiance, proof that even in war, creation could triumph over destruction. One story recorded in a Seabee diary tells of a group building huts during a typhoon on Guam. As the winds howled and the rain turned the ground into a swamp, they kept working, bolting panels together by lantern light. The next morning, when the storm passed, their hut still stood. Around it, trees had snapped and tents had vanished, but the curved steel shell remained anchored. They painted a sign above the entrance that read, "Built to last, Quonset Point." It was more than pride. It was gratitude. In that moment, the design proved its worth in the most unforgiving test imaginable. That same durability also made it invaluable in the aftermath of war. When peace returned, the world faced a new kind of crisis, a housing shortage on an unprecedented scale. Entire cities lay in ruins. Millions of veterans were returning home to start families, but there simply weren't enough homes to go around. The U.S. government, recognizing the surplus of Quonset huts, began selling them cheaply to civilians. What had once been temporary military housing became the foundation for post-war domestic life. Across America, these huts appeared in neighborhoods, college campuses, and rural towns. Some were repurposed into family homes, complete with porches and gardens. Others became churches, schools, or libraries. The adaptability of the design made it the perfect canvas for civilian creativity. With a few modifications, windows, insulation, paint, these steel shells transformed into warm, inviting spaces. The very structure that once represented war now symbolized recovery. One remarkable example took place at the University of Minnesota, where returning veterans flooded the campus after the war. The university responded by erecting dozens of Quonset huts to serve as classrooms and student housing. The students affectionately nicknamed the area Quonset Village. Photographs from the time show families cooking on small stoves, children playing outside, and professors lecturing beneath the curved ceilings. For thousands of Americans, these huts were not just shelters. They were the birthplace of dreams, education, and a new beginning. And while the Quonset hut's exterior remained humble, its interior often became a canvas for individuality. Soldiers and civilians alike personalized their huts with murals, curtains, and makeshift furniture. Artists turned them into studios, filling the curved walls with canvases and sculptures. Farmers transformed them into workshops. The simplicity of the design encouraged creativity. It was a blank slate that invited human touch. Perhaps that's why people became so attached to them. They were not sterile or mechanical. They were living spaces, molded by their occupants. As the decades passed, the Quonset hut's image evolved from practical to iconic. It came to represent a certain rugged optimism, a belief in the power of human invention. In an era defined by turmoil, it offered something rare: stability. Even now, when architects and engineers look back at the mid-20th century, the Quonset hut stands out as one of the purest expressions of purpose-driven design. It wasn't about prestige or legacy. It was about solving a problem with clarity and compassion. And that's what made it timeless. Its curved silhouette has since become a kind of shorthand for endurance. Whether it appears in historical photographs, war memorials, or modern architecture magazines, it evokes a sense of continuity, a reminder that good ideas never die. They simply adapt. The Quonset hut, in its simplicity, captures something profoundly human: our ability to build under pressure, to find strength in limitation, and to create permanence from impermanence. It is fitting, then, that the same principles that guided its creation, efficiency, adaptability, and empathy, now guide much of the world's response to crisis. When humanitarian groups erect prefab shelters for refugees, when scientists design sustainable housing for disaster zones, they are continuing the legacy of that Rhode Island experiment from 1942. The world may have changed, but the core challenge remains the same: how to shelter humanity quickly and wisely in the face of adversity. The Quonset hut answered that question once and continues to answer it still. In every sense, the Quonset hut was a paradox: temporary yet eternal, utilitarian yet beautiful, mass-produced yet deeply personal. Its creators could never have imagined that what they built for a single war would outlive the very century that spawned it. And yet, here it stands, its corrugated ribs gleaming in the sun across continents and climates, a silent testament to the power of simplicity. What truly set the Quonset hut apart from every other wartime structure was that it didn't age in the usual sense. Wooden barracks rotted, canvas tents disintegrated, even reinforced bunkers crumbled with time. But the Quonset endured. Its design was so fundamentally sound that it resisted decay both physically and conceptually. Engineers studying these structures decades later found that many required only minor maintenance: a coat of anti-rust paint here, a tightened bolt there, and they were good for another 20 years. In the world of architecture, that kind of longevity is almost mythical for a structure never meant to last. Part of this endurance came from the geometry itself. Arches are one of the oldest structural forms in human history. From Roman aqueducts to Gothic cathedrals, they have always represented stability and permanence. The Quonset hut was, in essence, the industrial heir to that legacy, a Roman arch reimagined in steel for the mechanized age. By uniting ancient geometry with modern materials, its creators unknowingly forged a bridge between eras. In doing so, they reminded the world that good design, no matter how humble, is timeless because it honors the laws of physics and nature. Its resistance to wind and weather was almost uncanny. When hurricanes swept through the Pacific Islands in the years following the war, Quonset huts often remained among the few structures still standing. Their half-cylinder profile deflected wind pressure like the wing of an airplane, redirecting energy rather than absorbing it. The smooth curvature also discouraged debris accumulation and water pooling, reducing long-term wear. In snowy climates, the arch naturally shed heavy loads, preventing collapse. The simplicity of the form wasn't just aesthetic, it was a complete system of self-defense, perfectly adapted to nature's challenges. But to speak only of its engineering is to miss its soul. The real power of the Quonset hut lay in what it represented to those who lived and worked inside. For soldiers in the Pacific, the huts were a piece of home amid chaos. For refugees in post-war Europe, they were a first roof after devastation. For young families in the booming suburbs of the 1950s, they were the first sign of stability. For farmers, artists, and mechanics, they became places of creation. Each one carried its own biography, written not in blueprints, but in human stories. There's a photograph taken in 1944 on Guadalcanal that captures this perfectly. A group of Navy men sit on makeshift chairs outside their Quonset hut, grinning as they cook a small meal on an oil drum converted into a stove. Behind them, the hut's curved silhouette gleams in the sunset. It's not just a structure, it's a sanctuary. Everything about that image speaks to the purpose of engineering: to serve life. The steel may have come from factories and the bolts from shipyards, but the meaning came from the people inside. After the war, as hundreds of thousands of surplus huts were sold to civilians, a kind of quiet revolution began. Towns across America sprouted Quonset homes, schools, and businesses. Some people saw them as temporary stopgaps, others saw them as opportunities. Veterans in particular took to them with a sense of nostalgia and ingenuity. They had built these huts under fire. Now they would build them in peace. With saws and paintbrushes, they transformed the cold military shells into warm domestic spaces. The sound of hammering that once echoed through jungles now echoed through quiet neighborhoods. Entire communities grew around these repurposed huts. One of the most famous examples was Quonset Village in Long Island, New York, where returning veterans settled with their families. Photographs from the time show neat rows of arched roofs, gardens between them, children on bicycles. The architecture might have been born of war, but the life within was pure peace. These villages became early models of affordable housing, a direct line from wartime necessity to peacetime opportunity. And yet, not everyone saw beauty in their simplicity. Critics at the time dismissed them as ugly, utilitarian relics. But for many, that plainness was part of the charm. They represented honesty, an unpretentious response to human need. Unlike the ornate houses of the pre-war era, Quonset huts made no attempt to disguise their purpose. They were what they were: structures of work and shelter. In their modesty, they carried dignity. They became symbols of a new kind of American dream, one grounded not in opulence, but in practicality and perseverance. In the decades that followed, the Quonset hut began to find unlikely admirers in the art and design world. Architects such as Norman Foster, Renzo Piano, and Shigeru Ban have all cited the importance of modularity and prefabrication, principles the Quonset pioneered. Buckminster Fuller, whose geodesic domes became symbols of futuristic architecture, once remarked that simplicity and efficiency are the ultimate sophistication. He could just as easily have been describing the Quonset hut. The same logic, using geometry to achieve strength with minimal material, runs through both designs. By the late 20th century, the Quonset had become a fixture in architectural education. Students studied it not just as an artifact, but as a master class in problem solving. It demonstrated how design could emerge from constraint rather than abundance. Professors often used it as an example when teaching systems thinking, the idea that every component, no matter how small, contributes to the whole. The Quonset hut worked because every piece was essential, every detail purposeful. It was, in essence, architecture distilled to mathematics. This educational legacy extended into the field of sustainability. When the green building movement gained momentum in the 1990s and 2000s, the Quonset hut found itself newly relevant. Its lightweight construction, minimal waste, and recyclability aligned perfectly with environmental goals. Some builders even began reviving the original military blueprints, adapting them for eco-housing. In California and Oregon, green Quonsets emerged, insulated, solar-powered, and built from recycled steel. The same design that once sheltered soldiers now served as a model for off-grid living. There's an undeniable poetry in that transformation. A building conceived to survive destruction ended up teaching the world how to build sustainably. It's as though the Quonset hut evolved from a wartime tool into a peacetime philosophy, a testament to resilience, adaptability, and the idea that strength lies not in rigidity, but in balance. Its arch wasn't just a shape, it was a symbol of equilibrium between form and function, nature and technology, chaos and order. And while modern architecture has grown ever more complex, digital renderings, exotic materials, parametric designs, the Quonset hut endures as a quiet counterpoint. It reminds us that simplicity is not the opposite of sophistication, it's the essence of it. You could say that every Quonset hut is a kind of meditation in steel, an elegant answer to the oldest human question: how do we make shelter in a world that's always changing? The continued survival of these huts across the globe, from the snowy plains of Alaska to the humid coasts of Micronesia, serves as living proof of their design brilliance. Walk into one today, and you can still feel it. The coolness of steel, the softness of filtered light, the reassuring curve above you. It's a feeling of protection, of purpose. And if you listen closely enough, you might even hear the echo of that first hammer striking metal at Quonset Point, the sound of an idea being born. Every Quonset hut that still stands today carries within it an unspoken story, a quiet dialogue between the past and the present. You can see it in the way rust patterns creep along the corrugation, in the way new windows cut through old steel, in the way ivy sometimes climbs its curved ribs like nature's hand tracing history's shape. Time, it seems, has been kind to these buildings, not because they resisted change, but because they embraced it. They were built to adapt, to climates, to people, to purposes. That adaptability is what made them immortal. It's hard not to marvel at how far the design has traveled, not just geographically, but conceptually. From a naval air station in Rhode Island to battlefields across the Pacific, from college campuses to suburban neighborhoods, and even into the imaginations of architects envisioning Mars colonies, the Quonset hut has crossed every boundary of culture, function, and era. Few designs have ever achieved that kind of universality. Its simplicity is its passport, its efficiency, its language. Wherever humans have needed shelter, quick, reliable, and strong, the spirit of the Quonset hut has followed. Even its name has become shorthand for practicality. To build a Quonset is to build something straightforward and resilient. It's a verb, a mindset, a design philosophy. That's because the Quonset hut embodies a fundamental truth about human creation, that great design doesn't dominate nature, it negotiates with it. The engineers who shaped that arch weren't trying to conquer wind or rain, they were learning to move with them. In doing so, they created a form that felt less like an imposition on the world and more like a conversation with it. In many ways, the Quonset hut also symbolizes the moral resilience of a generation. Born in the urgency of global war, it was an act of engineering mercy, a shelter meant to protect, not destroy. It shielded soldiers, saved supplies, and preserved life in places where chaos reigned. And after the war, instead of fading into memory, it found new meaning in peace. It became a vessel for rebuilding, of homes, of businesses, of communities. It's as though the structure itself refused to accept the finality of war. It transformed, just as the people who built it transformed, carrying forward a belief that creation can outlast destruction. One of the most extraordinary aspects of its story is the way it blurred the line between the military and the civilian, between necessity and creativity. When engineers designed the Quonset hut, they weren't thinking of art or architecture, they were thinking of logistics. Yet, in their pursuit of efficiency, they stumbled upon a form of art so honest that it became timeless. This is the paradox at the heart of the Quonset's beauty. It wasn't designed to be beautiful, but its truth made it so. It's a reminder that authenticity itself is an aesthetic, that what works well looks right. Throughout the late 20th and early 21st centuries, artists and architects alike began to rediscover that beauty. In cities like Detroit, Oakland, and Vancouver, abandoned Quonset huts became canvases for murals, installations, and creative reuse projects. Their curved interiors offered perfect acoustics for music studios, while their open spans provided freedom for workshops and galleries. Each renovation was a kind of dialogue across time, a collaboration between the hands of 1940s engineers and 21st century dreamers. These were not just restorations of buildings, they were restorations of purpose. In rural areas, the huts took on yet another life. Farmers continued using them as barns, grain silos, and storage sheds, but many also found unconventional uses, from wineries to distilleries to organic markets. Their structure lent itself perfectly to agriculture, easy to ventilate, resistant to wind, and cheap to maintain. You could walk through the Midwest today and see a Quonset every few miles, still in use, still vital. They've become part of the visual rhythm of the American landscape, steel crescents rising above cornfields and pastures like echoes of an older, humbler time. Internationally, the design kept evolving. In developing regions, variations of the Quonset hut became lifelines. Engineers and NGOs used its principles to design modular classrooms, clinics, and disaster shelters. Its prefabrication and low cost made it ideal for places hit by earthquakes or storms. In some cases, people even built hybrid versions from local materials, bamboo arches reinforced with steel strips or corrugated tin mounted on wooden ribs. The design had transcended material. It had become an idea that could adapt to any resource or context. That's what made it revolutionary. Not that it was made of steel, but that it could be made of anything. And yet, for all its transformations, the essence remained unchanged. The Quonset hut is a rare example of a design that never betrayed its origins. It didn't need to be reinvented or rebranded to stay relevant. It simply kept proving itself, decade after decade. That integrity is what gives it power. In a world obsessed with novelty, the Quonset hut stands as a quiet argument for endurance, for doing one thing so well that it never has to be replaced. But beyond its form and function, the Quonset hut carries a deeper lesson, one that transcends architecture entirely. It's about the human capacity to turn constraint into creativity. When the Navy handed down that impossible brief in 1942 to design a shelter that could survive bombs, storms, and heat, and be built by untrained men in a day, they weren't just issuing a technical challenge. They were posing a philosophical one. How do we make something simple enough to be universal, yet strong enough to endure the worst the world can offer? The answer became the Quonset hut, a symbol of what humanity can achieve when imagination meets urgency. That's why it continues to resonate today, even among people who've never seen one up close. In an era defined by rapid change and uncertainty, the Quonset hut represents something rare, permanence born of flexibility. It tells us that the solutions to our greatest problems don't always require complexity, they require clarity. It shows that good design is not about doing more, but about doing enough. It stands as a blueprint not just for shelter, but for thinking. Imagine, for a moment, standing inside one of those original huts, the air still, the steel cool beneath your fingertips. Outside, the world has changed beyond recognition. Digital technology, space travel, skyscrapers of glass and carbon fiber. But inside, you feel the same peace that a soldier might have felt in 1943, or a farmer in 1955, or a student in 1968. The shape hasn't aged, it hasn't dated. The curve above you still whispers the same truth, that strength can be humble and endurance can be quiet. That's the enduring miracle of the Quonset hut. It reminds us that the simplest lines can carry the weight of history. And even as new generations build taller, faster, and smarter, they are still following the same curve, one first drawn in haste on a blueprint in Rhode Island under the pressure of war. From that curve came not just a structure, but a philosophy of survival. And as long as there are storms to weather and people to shelter, that curve will never fade. What makes the story of the Quonset hut so hauntingly powerful is how invisible it has become. It surrounds us quietly, woven into the background of modern life, its origins often forgotten. And yet, if you trace the lines of countless contemporary innovations, from emergency shelters to modular housing, from aircraft hangars to sustainable ecopods, you find the same DNA repeating itself. The Quonset hut has become a kind of architectural ancestor, its descendants spread across every continent. Like an old melody remixed through time, its tune persists even when the world changes around it. In Rhode Island, where it all began, the original Quonset Point Naval Air Station still holds traces of that first experiment. Some of the earliest huts remain standing, preserved as historical relics. Walking among them, one can feel the energy of the moment when engineers first sketched their ideas under fluorescent lights, racing against the clock. Those 60 days in 1942 produced not only a building, but a method, a way of thinking that prized adaptability above all else. The Quonset hut wasn't the result of perfect conditions, it was the result of necessity turned into opportunity. That's why its spirit still resonates in times of crisis today. Consider how much of modern disaster relief architecture echoes the principles of the Quonset hut. When earthquakes strike or when floods displace thousands, humanitarian engineers still fall back on the same logic: prefabrication, modularity, lightness, and ease of assembly. The curved geometry might look different, the materials more advanced, but the heart of the solution is unchanged. That's not coincidence, it's legacy. The Quonset hut taught the world that true resilience in design comes from simplicity and reproducibility, not complexity. It proved that engineering could be both rapid and humane. And yet, what's even more fascinating is how the Quonset hut transcended its practical purpose to become a cultural symbol. For veterans, it came to represent the camaraderie and endurance of the war years. For architects, it became a touchstone for the beauty of function-driven design. For sociologists, it illustrated how technology can shape society long after its intended use has passed. Each discipline finds something different in its curved silhouette. To engineers, it's physics made visible. To artists, it's form born of truth. To historians, it's an artifact of human adaptability. Its cultural afterlife has been richly varied. You'll find Quonset huts repurposed as art museums in Canada, breweries in Oregon, yoga studios in California, and churches in Kenya. They've appeared in films, novels, and photography collections as visual metaphors for endurance. In some small towns, they serve as community centers where locals gather for markets, dances, and meetings. The same kind of structure that once sheltered weary soldiers from monsoon rains now shelters laughter and music. Few inventions can claim to have carried such a range of human emotion: fear, hope, exhaustion, joy, within the same steel ribs. What's remarkable is that the Quonset hut's influence continues to grow even as its physical presence diminishes. Digital architects working with 3D printing and advanced composites still return to its curved form when experimenting with efficient structures. Aerospace engineers studying inflatable habitats for Mars cite its geometry as a model of load distribution. Urban planners designing rapid housing solutions for growing cities often use the Quonset's modular logic: prefab panels, standardized parts, easy scalability. In an ironic twist, the design that once relied on human labor in the mud and heat of battle now informs structures built by robotic arms in sterile fabrication labs. The contexts change, the curve endures. In architectural theory, there's a concept known as honest structure, the idea that a building should reveal how it stands. The Quonset hut embodies that concept perfectly. There's no illusion, no hidden skeleton beneath a facade. The frame is the architecture. Its integrity is visible, its purpose self-evident. This transparency of design fosters trust. You understand it instinctively, even without training. That's one reason it could be built by non-engineers in wartime. It speaks a universal language. It's a building that teaches you how to build it, even as you assemble it. This quality of self-revelation gives the Quonset hut a kind of moral clarity. It doesn't pretend to be anything other than what it is: strong, efficient, and temporary, yet enduring through honesty. That ethos has profound resonance today, when so much of the modern world hides behind complexity. We surround ourselves with systems we barely understand, technologies that feel opaque. The Quonset hut, by contrast, invites participation. It says, "You can make me, you can repair me, you can understand me." In that invitation lies empowerment. It democratizes architecture in the same way the printing press democratized knowledge. It's also worth noting how the Quonset hut quietly redefined the relationship between people and their built environment. Before it, construction was the domain of specialists: carpenters, masons, architects. But the hut broke that hierarchy. It gave ordinary people the power to assemble something monumental with their own hands. That empowerment, especially during war, instilled a kind of faith in human capability. It proved that when design is clear and purposeful, anyone can become a builder. This principle would echo later in DIY culture, in modular furniture, in open-source design movements. The idea that you can build it yourself traces its lineage directly back to the ethos of Quonset Point. There's something profoundly democratic about that. The Quonset hut doesn't belong to any one nation, class, or ideology. It belongs to anyone who needs it. During its production, it sheltered soldiers from every background. After the war, it housed families from every walk of life. Its adaptability made it universal, as relevant in an Alaskan fishing town as in a Pacific Island village. The same structure could serve as a church in one place, a bar in another, a laboratory elsewhere. In a divided world, it became a quiet unifier. And still, through all these transformations, it has remained humble. It doesn't demand admiration. It simply is. A curved line against a skyline, a pattern of shadows across the ground at sunset. It has become part of the landscape's memory, like the rings in an old tree or the layers of rock on a cliff, silent witnesses to time passing. When you encounter one today, standing half hidden behind weeds or weathered by decades of storms, it feels almost alive. You sense that it has seen things, war and peace, laughter and loss, and that it endures not just because it's strong, but because it was built with purpose. The story of the Quonset hut, then, is not just about steel or design. It's about endurance as a form of grace. It's about how even in humanity's darkest moments we have the capacity to create something enduring, something that shelters both the body and the spirit. It reminds us that the true test of any invention is not how it begins, but how it continues, how it adapts, how it serves, how it outlives its purpose to find new ones. So when we speak of the Quonset hut, we're not merely recounting a chapter in military or architectural history. We're telling the story of an idea that refused to die. Born in haste, refined by necessity, embraced by millions, it transcended its era and became a part of who we are: builders, survivors, dreamers, problem solvers. The curved line that began at Quonset Point in 1942 continues, unbroken, through time and imagination. As the decades rolled on, the Quonset hut ceased to be just a relic of the past. It became a mirror, reflecting the enduring relationship between human ingenuity and survival. Its story didn't end with the last factory shipment in 1945. It simply changed shape, quietly merging into new contexts, new landscapes, and new generations. To see one today, standing proud beside a weather-beaten barn, or reborn as a cafe in a small town, is to glimpse the ghost of an age when design had to mean something, when every bolt and beam carried purpose. And that purpose was never just shelter, it was reassurance. In every war zone, every floodplain, every storm-ravaged coast where humans have had to start again, the spirit of the Quonset hut has returned, the same spirit that says, we can rebuild, and we can do it quickly. That philosophy has quietly guided emergency architecture for 80 years. When tents give way to sturdier prefabricated structures, when engineers deploy modular steel frames in crisis zones, when architects propose curved, self-supporting shelters for refugees, they are, knowingly or not, borrowing from the logic of that 1942 invention. The Quonset hut became a kind of template for resilience, a structural shorthand for hope. Architects and historians have often asked why this humble building holds such emotional weight. Part of the answer lies in its visual language. The curve of its roof is not just a functional choice, it's a symbol of embrace. There are no sharp edges, no imposing lines, no aggressive stance. It feels safe, encompassing, almost organic. It mirrors the curve of the horizon, the arc of the sky, the shape of the human eye itself. In that sense, it's one of the few industrial forms that manages to feel alive. Even people who know nothing of its history often describe Quonset huts as comforting, as though the structure itself remembers what it was built to do: protect. Inside, the space is equally distinctive. The curved walls create a natural sense of unity, of enclosure without confinement. The sound behaves differently. Footsteps soften, voices echo gently. Soldiers once called it the sound of calm, that hollow, protective resonance that made the world outside feel far away. Artists and musicians who have since repurposed these spaces say the same thing. There's something serene about the acoustics, something that invites focus. It's as if the building was engineered not only for durability, but for contemplation. And in a way, it was. The engineers at Quonset Point didn't design a monument. They designed a refuge. They didn't build for glory, but for need. They didn't have the luxury of ego or time. They had 60 days and a world at war, and yet within that constraint they created something eternal. That's why the Quonset hut remains such a profound lesson in design ethics. It proves that necessity is not the enemy of beauty, it's the origin of it. When stripped of ornament, distraction, and excess, what remains is truth, and truth has its own kind of elegance. Perhaps that's why modern architects, despite all the technological advancements since, still find themselves humbled by the Quonset hut. In an age of skyscrapers and 3D printed megastructures, it stands as a reminder that form should always serve function, and that simplicity often conceals genius. A Quonset hut doesn't try to impress, it performs. And in doing so, it transcends the very concept of style. It's not modern or retro or industrial, it simply is. Its relevance isn't locked in time. It renews itself each time someone recognizes that its lessons still apply. Its cultural footprint is enormous, even when invisible. Across films, novels, and memoirs, the Quonset hut often appears as a backdrop, a quiet symbol of transition. In war movies, it's the base at the edge of conflict. In post-war dramas, it's the temporary home of rebuilding. In documentaries, it's the laboratory or workshop where innovation happens. Each appearance reinforces its narrative role, the bridge between chaos and order, destruction and creation. It is architecture as storytelling, a physical metaphor for endurance. And endurance, after all, is what defines its legacy. More than 80 years later, thousands still stand. They dot coastlines, deserts, farmlands, and mountain valleys. Some gleam with fresh paint and new purpose. Others rust gracefully into the landscape. Each one is a relic, but also a participant, still serving, still standing. Few structures can claim such continuity of service. Cathedrals take centuries to build, skyscrapers crumble after decades. But the Quonset hut, born in haste, remains ageless because it was never about permanence. It was about adaptability. And adaptability is the closest thing to immortality design can achieve. There's a profound symmetry in the way the world has returned to the principles of 1942. As humanity prepares to colonize other planets, engineers face challenges eerily similar to those of the Seabees in the Pacific. How do you create a livable environment in a hostile landscape with limited materials and untrained labor? NASA's proposed Mars habitats echo the Quonset's logic almost exactly. Prefabricated modules, self-supporting curves, and airtight enclosures. It's poetic, really. The same idea that once sheltered men from tropical storms may one day shelter explorers from solar radiation. The same geometry that resisted bombs may one day resist the vacuum of space. The Quonset hut's legacy, it seems, was never confined to Earth. Yet even as it ascends to new frontiers, its heart remains profoundly human. Because at its core, the Quonset hut is not just a building, it's a conversation between need and creativity, between crisis and response. It's proof that our species, when pushed to the edge, doesn't only fight or flee, it builds. It makes shelter, connection, and meaning. That's what the curved steel shell represents, the instinct to endure with grace. In that sense, the Quonset hut belongs in the same lineage as the wheel, the plow, and the printing press, inventions that democratize survival. It took the exclusive art of construction and made it accessible. It proved that architecture didn't have to be grand to be revolutionary. Its creators didn't build for glory, they built for everyone. And in doing so, they created something greater than any monument, a design that refused to die. So when we talk about engineering marvels, the bridges, the towers, the dams, we should also talk about the humble hut that changed the way we think about shelter. Because behind every heroic innovation lies a quieter one, the kind that saves lives without fanfare. The Quonset hut is that kind of hero. Its story isn't about triumph in a single moment, but about endurance over decades, centuries perhaps, wherever people need a place to stand and start again. What began as a desperate wartime experiment became a lasting symbol of ingenuity. Its creators at Quonset Point could not have known that their 60-day solution would inspire 80 years of architecture, disaster relief, and space exploration. But maybe that's the ultimate lesson, that innovation often begins not with ambition, but with urgency, not with wealth, but with scarcity, not with peace, but with the need to survive. And so, as the waves still crash against the Rhode Island shore where it all began, the spirit of that invention remains, curving gently against the horizon, unyielding to time. The Quonset hut stands not just as a relic of war, but as a monument to the resilience of design and the resilience of humanity itself. Because in the end, What it built was never just shelter. It built belief in what humans can do when they refuse to give up. What began as a 60-day emergency project became an 80-year lesson in engineering resilience.